Hi, my name is Tom and welcome to my channel Integral Views. So the British public have been opposed to mass migration for decades. In fact, for as long as polling has existed, the British public have been against immigration at high levels. But our politicians, our leaders, what you could call the elite, thought that they knew better. So repeatedly and with ever increasing magnitude, they moved in the direction of mass migration since at least the end of World War II. And you can really see this as a class war in the UK between the elites and the working class. You've got the academics, the politicians, the lawyers, the senior business owners, for large corporations. And they're basically taking actions that are directly opposed to the wishes, to the will of the British public overall. And I really see this as a betrayal. They're basically looking down on the working class, right, on the British public overall, the vast majority of the British public. And they're saying, you know what, we know better. Not only do we know better, but we are better. Our views are better. We're better people. We know better, so we're going to do something different. But of course, mass migration alongside out-of-control corporatism that we see across the UK has not benefited living standards for British citizens, so the elite were completely wrong. Now maybe they're doing just fine, maybe they benefited financially, but certainly for British citizens this has not been a good thing. And I think an argument can definitely be made that this is the biggest betrayal of British citizens by the elite in maybe 2,000 years of British history. And that's really because it fundamentally changes the nation culturally and in many different ways. And if you're going to make such fundamental changes to a nation, you sure as hell should make sure that you have support of the majority of the citizens of that nation, given that you're a leader, right, a politician, and you're there to represent those citizens, right? Okay, so this is part 4 in my video series on legal migration. I'm going to put the playlist in the pinned comment on this video. So if you like this video, if you think it's useful or valuable, please like it and subscribe to my channel if you want to see more from me. So this video, as well as all my other videos, is based on my own research. I go and find the data, pull it all together, and then provide views that are hopefully helpful. I have no affiliations, no political affiliations or business or investment affiliations. This is really just for the benefit of Britain. In this video, I want to get an understanding of British sentiment on mass migration through multiple decades. And we're going to start with just a quick look at the historical context. So this chart here shows what happened with regard to the foreign-born population of the UK from the year 1900 all the way to the year 2025, where we are now. So in the year 1900, we started with 1.5% of the British population being foreign-born. As of today, it's 20%. That's a historically unprecedented level of people who are born in other countries in the UK at a single time. What I want to point out here really quick is that at the end of World War II, that obviously happened in the 1940s, we had this period that is referred to as a golden open door. And this is where the British Empire sort of crumbled and moved back gradually over time, actually quite quickly. So a lot of our sort of former colonies, we had this golden open door, and what that means is there were no visa restrictions. People could choose to move to Britain, and quite a lot of people did. And that golden open door period went from 1948 to 1962. So that was the initial opening up of the borders. And this caused kind of a reaction from the general public. So after this golden open door, after that golden door had been open for a long period of time, or a fairly long period of time, 1948 to 1962, there was this British reaction across the public. So effectively, a lot of people were very concerned about migration. And then that manifested with Enoch Powell's speech that is referred to as the Rivers of Blood speech. And that speech happened in 1968. I will go through that Rivers of Blood speech, but I just want to make a few kind of comments just generally about migrants that came over post-World War II. Even migrants that came over during that period, you can't even really see all migrants as the same because they're very different, of course, come from very different places, different cultures. And what we saw though overall, I would say, is a lot of integration we did see from from the migrants who came over in that period of time. There's been a lot of integration. That was 60 to 70 years ago. So there's been a significant amount of time since then, but I think that a lot of people did come here and basically integrated Windrush, and then you had people coming over from India and other places. But certain cultures, that I won't go into detail here, certain cultures didn't integrate in the same way, in my opinion. And that lack of integration has passed through multiple generations, in my view. And I think that basically now that certain individuals from those communities are represented within our politics, and they tend to take a very negative stance with regard to British history and culture. One last thing I want to say about immigrants that came after World War II, I would even say between World War II, mid-40s until the 1980s, is that they were really taking a leap into the unknown to a very large extent, a lot of them. So it's very different to today, because they didn't have smartphones and internet access, right, to go and see, what this land was, what Britain was and what it was like there. So they had not that much information. So it's quite a bold leap into the unknown. But that's very different to how it is today, because of course people all over the world now have smartphones and they can see our standard of living and they think, yeah, you know what, I'll have some of that. Generally, it's just a very different proposition. And out of people who migrated over to the UK in the 1950s and 60s, etc., we see now maybe second or even third generation. And some of those people are some of the most patriotic people that you'll see. I'll just provide two photos of examples. This is from the Unite the Kingdom march that happened in London recently. And so I took these photos of these two individuals and they were basically dripped out, right? They were in, full patriotic kind of clothing, etc. So this guy actually had British St. George's crosses that were stitched into his white shoes with red sequins. I was too embarrassed to take a photo from the front, but I took a photo from the back. Now after this event, I then went home and I saw the media reporting about this terrible far-right racist march that had occurred. But I'd spent the day interacting with people like this. Let's return to post-World War, okay, in the 1950s and 60s, what actually went on. So we had that golden open door period. But then in 1965, there was this survey here. And so what this shows is, well, ask the question, do you think that the government was right or wrong to introduce new measures to restrict migration? So in 1962, basically the government put in these restriction measures that required visas, etc., on people from previous colonies from the British Empire, okay? So they started to put in these restrictions because people were increasingly concerned about the numbers of people who are coming over to the UK. So who agreed, right? What percentages of people agreed with the government's policy of putting in those restrictions? Well, overall, it was 88% of people. So you've got 89% of Conservatives, 90% of Labour, and 91% Liberal. So overall, a very, very large majority of people actually agreed with the restrictions that were being put in place. Shortly after this, Enoch Powell made his Rivers of Blood speech. I'm going to go through some of that speech now. So he said, and these are just some extracted quotes from the Rivers of Blood speech. This is in 1968. Above all, people are disposed to mistake predicting troubles for causing troubles, and even for desiring troubles. If only, they love to think, if only people would talk about it, it probably wouldn't happen. So the interesting thing about this, so what he's basically saying is, people are making this mistake of, if you think about it and you talk about it, right, then you're going to manifest it. So it's much better not to think about it and not to talk about it. They mistake talking about something with actually the thing itself. Now, the interesting thing what he says here, so he says, if only, they love to think, if only people wouldn't talk about it, it probably wouldn't happen. But what I would say is it's worse than that, because things already do happen. So what we're seeing now is that things like the grooming gang scandal happen, and many other things happen, okay, and then we don't talk about them. It's not that they might happen in future, it's that they have happened, and then we just refuse to talk about them. Now, another comment from the Rivers of Blood speech. Now, he's talking about responsibility. Those who knowingly shirk it deserve, and not infrequently receive, the curses of those who come after. So, the next generations curse generations that caused issues that manifest for those next generations. And then later he says, in 15 or 20 years, on present trends, there will be in this country 3.5 million Commonwealth immigrants and their descendants. 3.5 million. Well, now we actually have 890 or even over 1 million some years, people coming to the UK, and they're not from Commonwealth countries, Commonwealth immigrants, okay? And that doesn't include descendants. And this next bit's really interesting. It's basically kind of like he's looking into a crystal ball and predicting the future. He says, of course, it will not be evenly distributed from Argate to Aberystwyth. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that. And from Penzance to Aberdeen. Whole areas, towns, and parts of towns across England will be occupied by sections of the immigrant and immigrant descendant population. That's true. We actually have essentially whole towns that are immigrant population with their own culture, probably, not speaking English all that often, etc. Now, some of the language that he uses, I'm not comfortable with, actually, I've got to say. I think it's kind of a timing thing. But, he goes on to say, consequences of an alien element introduced into a country or population are profoundly different according to whether that element is 1% or 10%. That's absolutely true. So, of course, it's a volume thing. Okay, so if you have 1% and then you have a long period of time where there's an integration process culturally, etc., then it's very different to importing 20% foreign born within a single generation. So let's see, did the British people at the time agree with what Enoch Powell was saying? So, on the whole, do you agree or disagree with the views on immigration expressed by Mr. Enoch Powell? So, out of all people, 67% of the population at the time agreed with Enoch Powell. And the next question is interesting. Do you think Mr. Heath was right or wrong to dismiss Mr. Powell from the shadow cabinet? And basically, out of all people, 61% thought that it was the wrong decision. So Enoch Powell was basically dismissed from the shadow cabinet, right, because what he said was beyond the pale and unacceptable, even though 67% of the British population at that time agreed with him, and 61% thought it was the wrong thing to do to kick him out the shadow cabinet. And so you can see this emerging kind of disparity, this emerging schism between the elite and the general citizens in Britain. To be honest, I think that this difference, this kind of echo chamber in the elite has been going on for hundreds of years, in Britain of course, but this is such a stark example of it. Now, the British public were incredibly concerned about immigration with this golden open door, right? And then in the 1960s, in 1963, we went through this period of restriction. So between 1963 and 1996, we implemented restrictions. Of course, there was still an increase in the foreign-born population, but it was nothing like what came before, directly after World War II, and then what came after. Now what I want to do is get a view of what is the British sentiment overall on immigration. So I had to go through many different sort of data sources because it's actually quite difficult to just get it all from one source. Some of the sort of time series data, it doesn't track back long enough, and I wanted to go back pretty far. So I made this chart, okay, and this shows basically how many people, what percentage of the UK population wanted immigration to be reduced. So what we see is 1965 it was 88%. And then it stays pretty high, right? And it starts to go down. But it's always the majority. As of the latest data in 2025, 67% of the British population want immigration reduced. So the British population have been very clear for a very long time. Now, something I noticed about this chart is that we've seen a reduction in the number of people who want immigration restricted, okay, from 1960 all the way to 2025. So the number of people who want that, the percentage of people who want immigration restricted has decreased from 88% down to 67%, okay? So that's a 21% drop. But in that time, we've seen a 15% increase in the foreign-born population in the UK. Does that explain why people want immigration reduced to a lesser degree? Because immigrants themselves, of course, are more likely to want immigration to continue. Now I'm just going to show up the data sources that I used for this chart quickly. So if anyone wants to go and have a look themselves, here's where I got the information from. Now I just want to show two quick charts that are fairly recent that show where we've ended up now. So 45% of Britons say they would support an immigration scenario whereby no more new migrants were admitted and a large number of recent migrants were required to leave. Okay, so what we can see here, it's highlighted, admitting no more new migrants and requiring large numbers of migrants who came to the UK in recent years to leave. It's the majority actually, so it's 45%. Okay, but then you've got that section of don't know in between. So you've got 45% who agree, right, support or strongly support, and then you've got 44% on the other side who basically strongly oppose or oppose. And then we've got this other chart, right? And this is a really interesting one. So basically what this shows is the dissatisfaction that the general public have with the government's handling of immigration. And there was something really interesting that happened there in 2020. Actually, so just to provide some context, of course, Brexit happened, right? And generally in the data, what you see is Brexit occurs and people start to kind of relax with regard to immigration. It's less salient. People think it's a solved issue. They think, oh, we've voted Brexit and now this issue is going to go away. And so you start to see basically this shift of people thinking, not that dissatisfied, they're going ahead, we've voted for it, it's going to get better. But then as soon as the Boris wave kind of manifests, then the British sentiment shoots up and it becomes again like the leading issue that people think is the most important issue in British politics. And let's just have a look at the levels of immigration overall. Okay, so this chart goes all the way back to 1964. This is from the ONS. And overall, you can see from 1964 until about 1994, 1995, 1997 really. So you can see it's kind of hovering around neutral. So you've got people coming in, you've got people leaving the country, but it's hovering around neutral, around 200,000 a year coming in, and then around 200,000 people leaving, and it's kind of just going along. And then in the mid-90s, it just goes up and up and up, and we know the rest of the story. Something I want to cover really quickly here is this chart. This is from Maury. Okay, so Maury interviewed a representative quota sample of 2,057 adults aged 15 plus in 2003. Okay, and so they said basically they read out this question. Okay, you do not have to be white to be British, and 48% of people asked strongly agreed, and 39% tended to agree. So that's 87% of British people who said you don't have to be white to be British in 2003. And actually that kind of holds. I think that holds to a large extent. Frankly, how dare they? How dare the elite think that they know so much better, that they are better, because they're not, right? And ultimately they represent us as citizens. Mass migration has really increased the labour supply. It's been great for capital owners, and you can learn more about that in the last video that I did. But effectively what's happened, right, is that British citizens, workers, the majority of British people, have clearly been against this for decades. Okay, very clearly. And yet the elite think that they know better and they're going to do it anyway. It's quite literally a wholesale, generational betrayal of British citizens, of British workers. And now we're in this situation where we have to hear consistently about how terrible British culture is. But not only that, right, we have to basically have these blasphemy laws suggested by people from other cultures, okay, migrants, second generation, doesn't matter, migrants from other cultures who are saying, you know, we need to re-implement blasphemy laws, okay, and here's an example of a Labour MP who is basically calling for Islamophobia crackdowns. Acts of such mindless desecration only serve to fuel division and hatred within our society. What I want to say about this is, what about the desecration of British culture that we see on an almost daily basis and have done for many decades? What about that desecration? That desecration that our elites have enabled against our will. And we see people like David Olusoga, who is basically creating this constant stream of documentaries, right, of these series that are put out by our state broadcaster, our publicly funded state broadcaster, that are biased. They are biased against the British Empire, against the British culture, and against British history. So they create these views where they look at the sort of transatlantic slave trade, but then they don't look at what was happening in Africa, they don't look at what was happening in India. It's all portrayed from the perspective of Britain is just the worst, just terrible, bad, bad, bad. And I watched a great video on YouTube about this. I'm going to put some details of that on the screen right now. So if you're interested, go check that out. I recommend it. So let's summarise this situation. Since the 1960s at least, the British population overall in the large majority have been opposed to mass migration. They have wanted reductions in immigration. Politicians listened temporarily from around the mid-1960s until the mid-1990s, but then they completely stopped listening. British citizens in polling kept saying no, but the politicians thought they knew better, and then they opened the floodgates against the will of the British people. We joined the EU, of course, we had essentially open borders with the EU, and then we left the EU because the British people were not happy with that situation. But then our elite once again used that as an opportunity to go against the British public on immigration and take it to whole new levels. So the really interesting thing in looking into the polling on this and understanding British sentiment that I noticed is that it's kind of like across political parties, across the different sexes, so male and female, okay, men and women, and essentially right the way across the UK. It's been really consistent for decades. It's always been strongly opposed. It's really difficult to find anything that the British public agree on so strongly for such a long period of time. And it really begs the question, what will it take for our politicians to actually listen? What's it going to take? And now that the elite, the politicians, the think tankers, the academics, the business owners, etc., not all business, the big business owners, okay, now that they have overruled the British public, are they going to take responsibility? Where are the apologies? So having really looked into this myself, looked at the polling, read the questions, looked at the results, looked at the charts on what happened even after the results, okay? So what I basically get from this is this kind of class war. This is the elite thinking they know better, and the population overall basically wanting one thing and not getting it consistently over decades. And this is a really important topic, isn't it? This changes the entire nature of the country. It changes our culture. So it's really important. But you know what I think's happening? I think we're in the midst of a revolution. I think that the elites are being replaced. I think the politicians, senior civil servants, the judiciary, right? And I think effectively the think tankers, the academics, they're being proven wrong, okay? They're being proven wrong by the public, by distribution of media. Their ideology is being shown to be wrong. And they have to face the fact now that they didn't do what the British public wanted. So it's on them. The results are on them. If they're not good results, they own it. They should apologise. And I'll be totally honest, I'm left thinking there has to be some kind of penance. Yes, they can apologise. But really, I want them to, basically clean it up. Clean up what you've done. Okay, so that's it for today. In my next video, I'm going to talk about what do we do? What are some reasonable policies? What can we actually do? Is remigration a thing? And how would we go about it if it is? I want to say a huge thank you to everybody who gave me a super thanks, but also people who commented. It's really quite surprising to see people supporting me in that way. I can't explain it, but yeah, it means so much. And the comments are amazing. So I read so many of them, by the way. I read hundreds of comments. So please like the video if you liked it and if you found it useful or valuable, and please subscribe to my channel if you want to hear more from me. Until next time, thanks for watching. Cheers.